This is the story of the only time in modern history that a football match helped trigger a real war, with real soldiers, real bombs, and thousands of real deaths. They call it the Football War, and it actually happened. To be clear from the start, football did not cause this war on its own. The two countries were already sitting on a mountain of tension. But 3 football games lit the match that set the whole thing on fire. The year was 1969. The two countries were El Salvador and Honduras, two small neighbors in Central America, and under the surface, they were boiling. Honduras was the bigger country with more land. El Salvador was tiny and overcrowded. So over the years, hundreds of thousands of poor Salvadorans had crossed the border to live and farm in Honduras, and many Hondurans resented them for it. The government began forcing Salvadoran families off their land and out of the country. People were angry. People were scared. The two nations already hated each other. And then, into this powder keg came football. Because El Salvador and Honduras were drawn against each other to qualify for the 1970 World Cup, it was a two-legged playoff, one game in each country. The first game was in Honduras, and the home fans made sure the Salvadoran players got no sleep. All night, crowds surrounded the team hotel, banging on pots, setting off fireworks, screaming. The exhausted El Salvador team lost the next day 1-0. Back in El Salvador, a young woman was so distraught by the defeat that she took her own life. The country treated her as a national martyr. Her funeral was broadcast on television, with the players and the president in attendance. That is how deep this had already gone. Now it was time for the second game in El Salvador. And this time, it was the Honduran players who got the sleepless, terrifying treatment. The atmosphere was poisonous. El Salvador won that game 3-0. The Honduran coach later said his players were lucky to lose, because at least it meant they got out of the country alive. Around these games, the violence spilled into the streets. Fans from both sides were attacked. Salvadorans living in Honduras were beaten and chased out. Border clashes broke out. The football had turned the existing hatred into open fury. The two teams had to meet one more time on neutral ground in Mexico to decide who qualified. El Salvador won 3-2 after extra time, and on that very same day, the 27th of June 1969, El Salvador officially cut off all relations with Honduras. Less than 3 weeks later, on the 14th of July, it stopped being about football completely. The Salvadoran Air Force and Army launched a full military attack on Honduras. For about 100 hours, the two countries were at war. Planes dropped bombs. Towns were shelled. It became known as the 100-Hour War. By the time other Central American nations forced a ceasefire, around 3,000 people were dead, and hundreds of thousands had lost their homes. Now, historians are very clear. The real causes were land, poverty, and the immigration crisis that had been building for years. The football did not create that hatred, but it focused it. It gave a furious population a stage, a flashpoint, and a date. The matches were the spark that finally lit a fuse that was already there. And that is why, more than 50 years later, those 3 football games are still remembered as the trigger for an actual war. A reminder that sometimes sport is never just sport. It can carry all the anger of a nation behind it. So the next time someone tells you it is only a game, you can tell them about the summer 2 countries went to war and how it started on a football pitch. If you enjoyed falling down this rabbit hole, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.